3 months had passed since Ethan slipped the ring onto Haley's finger in the flickering candlelight of their kitchen. 3 months of morning coffee shared in comfortable silence, of Lily's laughter echoing through rooms that had once known only tension and fear. 3 months of learning what it meant to live rather than simply survive. The cabin had transformed from a safe house into something resembling a home. Haley had hung curtains in the windows, soft cream fabric that let the morning light filter through in golden streams. Lily's drawings covered the refrigerator, a gallery of crayon masterpieces depicting their new life together. The scent of fresh bread often drifted from the kitchen, replacing the lingering smell of gun oil and fear. Ethan found himself changing in ways that surprised him. His phone no longer rang at all hours with urgent demands from his organization. The meetings that once consumed his nights had dwindled to occasional check-ins with his most trusted lieutenants. Marcus, his right-hand man, handled most of the day-to-day operations of what remained of the legitimate businesses they'd salvaged from the wreckage of the old empire. But peace, Ethan was learning, was more fragile than power had ever been. On a Tuesday morning in late September, Haley stood at the kitchen counter, her nursing textbook spread before her. She'd decided to finish her degree, something that had seemed impossible during those dark months when every day was a battle for survival. The acceptance letter from the local university sat propped against the coffee maker, a reminder of the life she was building for herself beyond the shadows of Ethan's world. Anatomy and physiology, she muttered, highlighting a passage about cardiac function. Who knew the heart was so complicated? Ethan looked up from where he sat at the table, helping Lily color within the lines of a butterfly. His lips curved into the kind of smile that still caught Haley off guard with its genuine warmth. I could have told you that months ago. She threw a pencil eraser at him, which he caught effortlessly. Some reflexes, it seemed, never faded entirely. Lily giggled, her small hand guiding a purple crayon across the page. Daddy's good at catching things. Among other talents, Haley said, though her tone was light, affectionate. The darkness that had once defined Ethan's skill set was something they rarely spoke about now, a sleeping beast they all preferred to let lie. The morning routine continued with practiced ease. Ethan drove Lily to the small private school they'd enrolled her in, a place where her last name didn't carry the weight of fear it once had. Haley gathered her books and headed to her part-time job at the local clinic, work that Dr. Martinez had helped her secure. It was honest work, meaningful work, and it felt like stepping into the person she'd always wanted to be. But shadows have a way of creeping back, even into the brightest rooms. The call came while Ethan was reviewing financial reports in his small home office. Marcus's voice was tight with a tension Ethan hadn't heard in months. We've got a problem, boss. Vincent Romano is out. Ethan's hand stilled on the papers. Romano's nephew, Vincent, had been serving a 5-year sentence for arms trafficking when his uncle's empire fell. Out how? He had 3 years left. Good behavior. Early release. But that's not the worst part. Marcus paused, and Ethan could hear the sound of traffic in the background, suggesting his lieutenant was calling from the street, away from prying ears. Word is he's been making moves from inside, building alliances. The old man might be broken, but Vincent's young, hungry, and he's got a score to settle. Ethan closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the past pressing against the fragile walls of his new life. How long do we have? Hard to say. Maybe days, maybe weeks. But Ethan, he knows about Haley, about Lily. He's been asking questions. The conversation ended with Ethan's quiet promise to handle it, but as he sat in the growing afternoon light, he wondered if handling it was even possible without destroying everything he'd fought to build. When Haley returned home that evening, she found Ethan on the porch, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. His posture was rigid, the relaxed man from that morning replaced by someone who looked like he was carrying the weight of the world. Bad day? She asked, settling into the chair beside him. Ethan's jaw worked silently for a moment before he spoke. Vincent Romano is out of prison. The name hit Haley like a physical blow. She'd heard enough about the Romano family to understand what this meant. Old wounds, unfinished business, the kind of vendetta that didn't die with prison sentences or fallen empires. What does that mean for us? Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she set down her bag. I don't know yet. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. They sat in silence as the sun dipped behind the trees, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Somewhere in the distance, Lily's voice drifted from the living room where she was playing with her dolls, oblivious to the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. "We knew this might happen," Haley said finally. "That the past might catch up." Ethan turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the dying light. "I promised you it was over. You promised you'd try to make it over. There's a difference." The distinction mattered more than either of them wanted to admit, because trying meant there was still a chance for failure, still a possibility that the man Ethan had been might eclipse the man he was becoming. That night, after Lily had been tucked into bed with extra kisses and her favorite story, Ethan made the first of many calls that would pull him back toward the darkness he'd tried so hard to leave behind. The warehouse on the outskirts of town had been abandoned for years, its broken windows and rusted steel a testament to the industrial decay that plagued the area. It was the perfect place for a meeting that couldn't happen in polite society, away from the prying eyes of law enforcement and curious civilians. Ethan arrived alone, despite Marcus's protests. Some conversations required the kind of privacy that only came with isolation, and Vincent Romano had requested this meeting through channels that suggested he wanted to talk, not fight. Yet. Vincent was already there when Ethan stepped through the shadows, his silhouette outlined against the weak afternoon light filtering through the skeletal remains of the building. He was younger than his uncle, perhaps 35, with the lean build of a man who'd spent years in prison staying sharp. His dark hair was perfectly styled despite the decrepit surroundings, and his suit looked expensive enough to buy a small car. "Ethan Moretti," Vincent said, his voice carrying the slight rasp of a man who'd learned to speak quietly in places where loud voices attracted unwanted attention. The king who walked away from his throne. "Vincent Romano," Ethan replied, keeping his own voice level. "The nephew who thinks he can claim a kingdom that no longer exists." Vincent laughed, a sound devoid of genuine humor. "Oh, but it does exist, Ethan. It's just been neglected. My uncle was old, tired, too set in his ways. But me? I've had 5 years to think about how to do things better." They circled each other like predators, each taking the measure of the other. Ethan saw ambition in Vincent's eyes, but also intelligence. This wouldn't be the brutal, straightforward war that his uncle had waged. This would be something more subtle, more dangerous. "What do you want, Vincent?" "Want?" Vincent paused near a stack of rotting crates, his fingers drumming against the wood. "I want what was taken from my family. I want the respect that comes with power. I want the empire my uncle built before you tore it down. Your uncle's empire was built on fear and blood. It was dying long before I put it out of its misery." "Was it? Or did you just want it for yourself?" Vincent's eyes glittered with malice. "But that's not why I asked you here. I know about your little family. The nurse, the daughter. Quite the domestic picture you've painted." Ethan's hand moved slightly toward his jacket, but Vincent held up a finger in warning. I'm not here to threaten them. Not today. I'm here to make you an offer. I'm listening." Vincent smiled, and Ethan was reminded uncomfortably of his uncle's predatory grin. "I'm rebuilding, but I'm not stupid. I know you still have resources, connections, legitimacy that I lack. Work with me. Help me establish my organization, and I'll make sure your retirement remains peaceful." The offer hung in the air between them like smoke. Ethan studied Vincent's face, looking for tells, for signs of deception. He found them in the slight tension around the younger man's eyes, the way his fingers continued their restless drumming. "And if I refuse?" Vincent shrugged, the gesture too casual to be genuine. "Then I suppose we'll find out just how much you value your new life, how much you're willing to sacrifice to protect it." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Ethan had faced down dozens of enemies over the years, men who favored bombs and bullets and direct confrontation. Vincent was something different, something potentially more dangerous. He was patient, strategic, willing to play a long game that could unfold over months or years. "I'll need time to consider your offer," Ethan said finally. "Of course, but don't take too long. I'm not the only one who knows about your family, and not everyone shares my restraint. Vincent walked toward the exit, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. At the doorway, he paused and looked back. Oh, and Ethan. Give my regards to Haley. I understand she's quite lovely. It would be a shame if anything were to happen to someone so innocent. The warehouse fell silent except for the sound of wind whistling through the broken windows. Ethan stood alone among the shadows, feeling the weight of his old life pressing against the fragile walls of his new one. When he finally emerged into the fading daylight, Marcus was waiting by the car, his face grim. How much did you hear? Ethan asked. Enough. He's not bluffing about rebuilding. My sources say he's already got backing from families in Chicago and Miami. They smell blood in the water. Ethan climbed into the passenger seat, suddenly feeling every one of his years. What else? He's been asking questions about Haley's routine, what time she leaves for work, where she goes to school, which clinic she works at, and Lily's school. He's had someone watching it for the past week. The revelation hit Ethan like a physical blow. He'd thought they were safe, thought the quiet months had meant the past was truly buried, but Vincent Romano was proving that some graves were too shallow to hold their secrets. Double the security on both of them. Discreet, but effective. And start reaching out to our old allies. If Vincent wants to play games, we'll remind him what happened to the last Romano who underestimated us. Marcus nodded, but his expression remained troubled. Boss, there's something else. About the early release. Vincent didn't get out on good behavior. Ethan looked at his lieutenant sharply. He got out because someone made it happen, someone with serious pull in the system. This isn't just about Vincent rebuilding his uncle's empire. Someone's backing him, someone with resources we haven't identified yet. The drive home passed in contemplative silence. Ethan watched the familiar landscape roll by, the small towns and wooded hills that had become their sanctuary. Somewhere out there, Vincent Romano was weaving a web of threats and promises, pulling strings that could unravel everything Ethan had fought to build. As they pulled into the gravel driveway of the cabin, Ethan saw Haley through the kitchen window, helping Lily with what looked like homework. The scene was so perfectly normal, so beautifully ordinary, that it made his chest ache with the need to protect it. But protection, he was learning, came at a price, and Vincent Romano was about to present the bill. Haley noticed the changes first in small things. The way Ethan's phone began ringing again at odd hours. Conversations conducted in hushed tones behind closed doors. The return of men in dark suits who appeared and disappeared like shadows around the property's perimeter. The subtle tension that crept back into his shoulders, the way his eyes began scanning rooms and exits, with the old vigilance she'd hoped was buried forever. She didn't say anything at first. Part of her hoped it was temporary, a brief flicker of the old life that would fade back into memory. But after a week of watching the man she loved slowly transform back into the guarded stranger she'd first met, she couldn't stay silent any longer. "We need to talk," she said one evening after Lily had gone to bed. Ethan was standing at the living room window, his reflection ghostly in the darkened glass. He'd been there for 20 minutes, watching shadows that might or might not contain threats. "I know," he said without turning around. "I've been trying to figure out how to tell you." Haley moved to stand beside him, her shoulder brushing against his arm. Through the window, she could see the faint outline of one of his men positioned near the tree line, a reminder that their peaceful sanctuary was becoming something else entirely. "Vincent Romano wants me to help him rebuild his uncle's empire," Ethan said finally. "In exchange, he'll leave us alone. And if you refuse," Ethan's jaw tightened, "then he's made it clear that you and Lily become targets." The words hung between them like a loaded weapon. Haley felt something cold settle in her stomach, the familiar fear that she'd thought was behind them forever. "So what do we do?" "I don't know." The admission seemed to cost him something. "If I help him, I become part of his organization. Everything we've built, everything we've worked for, gets pulled back into that world. But if I don't, he hurts us to hurt you." Ethan turned to face her then, and she saw the war being fought behind his eyes. The man who wanted to protect his family warring with the man who'd sworn to leave violence behind. "There might be another way," he said slowly, I could eliminate the threat entirely. Vincent, his backers, anyone else who might come after us. It would be clean, final. Haley's breath caught. You mean kill them? I mean protect my family by any means necessary. The casual way he said it chilled her more than any overt threat could have. This was the Ethan Moretti that others had feared, the man who could discuss murder as calmly as planning dinner. She'd thought that man was gone, or at least buried deep enough never to surface again. No, she said firmly. That's not who you are anymore. Isn't it? His voice was harsh now, edged with frustration. Maybe I've been fooling myself, thinking I could just walk away from what I am. Maybe Vincent's right, and I'm still the same man who built an empire on violence and fear. Haley reached for his hands, feeling the tension in his fingers, the way they wanted to curl into fists. You're the man who chose to spare Romano when you could have killed him. You're the man who reads bedtime stories to his daughter and remembers how I like my coffee. That man is real, Ethan. Don't let Vincent Romano take him away from us. For a moment she thought she'd reached him. His hands relaxed slightly in hers, and some of the hardness left his eyes. But then his phone buzzed, and the spell was broken. The text message was simple, but its impact was devastating. Tomorrow, 3 p.m. Lily's school. We need to see how serious you are about my offer. Ethan's face went white, then red with a fury that made the air in the room seem to crackle with electricity. When he looked up at Haley, she saw something that terrified her more than any threat could have. She saw a man who was about to cross a line he'd sworn never to cross again. Call Marcus, he said, his voice deadly quiet. Tell him to meet me at the warehouse, and pack a bag for you and Lily. Ethan. Now, Haley. We're out of time for anything else. She wanted to argue, to find some other solution, but the look in his eyes told her that the moment for negotiation had passed. Vincent Romano had made a critical error in judgment. He'd threatened a child, and that was a line that even reformed kings didn't allow to be crossed. As Haley moved toward the bedroom to pack, she heard Ethan making the calls that would pull him fully back into the darkness. Each conversation was brief, professional, and utterly terrifying in its efficiency. By the time she'd filled 2 suitcases with their essential belongings, Ethan had assembled a small army. Men she recognized from the old days began arriving at the cabin, their faces grim with the kind of purpose she'd hoped never to see again. Where are you taking us? She asked as Ethan loaded their bags into the car. Somewhere safe, somewhere Vincent can't find you while I handle this. And after you handle it? Ethan paused, one hand on the car door, his back to her. I don't know if there will be an after, Haley. Not the kind we've been building. The admission broke something inside her chest. All those months of healing, of learning to trust in a future together, and it was crumbling because of one man's ambition and another man's past. This isn't over, she said fiercely. Whatever happens, whatever you have to do, we find our way back to each other. You promised me forever, Ethan Moretti. Don't you dare break that promise now. He turned then, and for just a moment, she saw through the armor he was rebuilding around himself. She saw fear, love, and a desperate hope that somehow they could survive what was coming. I love you, he said simply. Remember that, no matter what you hear about what I do next. As they drove through the darkening landscape toward a safe house Haley had never seen, she watched in the side mirror as their cabin grew smaller and smaller behind them. It felt like watching their dreams disappear into the night. Beside her, Lily slept peacefully in her car seat, unaware that her father was preparing for war. In the front seat, Ethan made call after call, each one pulling him deeper into the world he'd tried so hard to escape, and somewhere in the darkness ahead of them, Vincent Romano waited with the patience of a predator who believed he'd already won. The safe house was a fortress disguised as a suburban home, nestled in a quiet neighborhood where children played in carefully manicured yards and soccer moms drove minivans to grocery stores. To any casual observer, it looked utterly ordinary. But Haley noticed the subtle signs that marked it as something else entirely. The reinforced windows, the too-perfect positioning that allowed clear sight lines in all directions, the way the neighboring houses all seemed to be occupied by people who watched the street with professional interest. It's temporary, Ethan assured her as they carried their bags to the front door. But his eyes were already distant, his mind focused on strategies and contingencies that didn't include domestic comfort. Inside, the house was functional rather than welcoming. Clean lines, minimal furniture, and technology that spoke of surveillance and security rather than family living. Lily took one look around and immediately claimed a corner of the living room for her coloring books. Her 5-year-old adaptability both heartening and heartbreaking. Marcus was waiting in what might have been a dining room if it weren't filled with monitors, communication equipment, and detailed maps of the city. His face was grim as he handed Ethan a tablet loaded with intelligence reports. "Vincent's been busy," Marcus said, his voice low enough that Lily couldn't hear from the next room. "He's got backing from the Torino family in Miami, the Castellanos from Chicago, and at least 3 smaller operations looking to carve up territory. This isn't just about rebuilding the Romano Empire. It's about consolidating power across multiple markets." Ethan studied the tablet, his jaw tightening with each piece of information. Numbers? Maybe 60 soldiers plus support staff and civilian assets. They're well-funded and well-armed, and they've been planning this for months. Haley felt the blood drain from her face. The scope of what they were facing was far beyond anything she'd imagined. This wasn't just Vincent Romano nursing a family grudge. This was organized crime on a scale that could reshape the entire regional power structure. "What about law enforcement?" she asked. "Surely they're monitoring this kind of activity." Marcus exchanged a look with Ethan that made her stomach drop. "Vincent's got protection. Federal level. Someone's making sure the right people don't ask the right questions." The implication was staggering. Vincent wasn't just building a criminal empire. He was doing it with the tacit approval or active assistance of someone within the government. That level of corruption suggested resources and connections that dwarfed anything they could bring to bear. "So what's our play?" Marcus asked. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, studying the intelligence reports with the focused intensity of a general planning a campaign. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the cold authority that Haley remembered from their darkest days. "We hit them first, before they're fully established. Take out the key support structures and leave Vincent isolated. If his backing evaporates, his soldiers will scatter. That's a lot of moving pieces," Marcus warned, "and a lot of ways for things to go wrong. Then we make sure they don't go wrong." Haley listened to them plan with growing horror. They were talking about coordinated strikes against multiple targets, operations that would require the kind of violence and precision that belonged to war zones, not suburban America. This was the world Ethan had tried to leave behind, and it was pulling him back with the inexorable force of gravity. "There has to be another way," she said suddenly. Both men looked at her, and she saw pity in their expressions that made her want to scream. "What about negotiation? What if we give Vincent what he wants?" "He wants me," Ethan said simply. "He wants me to kneel, to acknowledge that he's the power now. And once I do that, once I'm part of his organization, there's no walking away. Not for any of us. Then we run. We disappear, start over somewhere else." "Where?" Ethan's voice was gentle but implacable. "He's got backing from families in multiple cities, connections in federal law enforcement. How long before he tracks us down? 6 months? A year? And what kind of life is that for Lily? Always running, always looking over our shoulders." The logic was sound, but it felt like surrender to everything they'd fought to build. Haley thought of the ring on her finger, the crayon drawings on the refrigerator back at the cabin, the simple domestic dreams that were crumbling under the weight of Vincent Romano's ambition. "I need some air," she said, standing abruptly. The backyard of the safe house was small but private, surrounded by a high fence that blocked the view from neighboring properties. Haley sat on the single concrete step that led from the back door, wrapping her arms around her knees and trying to process the impossible situation they'd found themselves in. She'd known, intellectually, that Ethan's past might catch up with them, but she'd imagined it as something manageable, a threat they could face together and overcome. She hadn't anticipated Vincent Romano, with his patience and resources and willingness to threaten children. She hadn't understood that sometimes the past didn't just catch up, it swallowed everything in its path. "Mommy?" Lily's small voice came from the doorway. Are you sad? Haley turned to see her standing there with her favorite stuffed elephant clutched against her chest, her dark eyes wide with the kind of perceptive concern that children sometimes displayed. She looked so much like Ethan in that moment that it took Haley's breath away. A little, Haley admitted, patting the step beside her. Come sit with me. Lily settled against her side with the unconscious trust of childhood. Is Daddy going to have to go away again? The question cut deeper than any knife could have. How did you explain to a 5-year-old that her father might have to become someone else entirely to keep her safe? How did you prepare a child for the possibility that the man who read her bedtime stories might not come home one night? He might have to work some, Haley said carefully. But he loves us very much, and he's going to do everything he can to keep us together. Is it because of the bad men? Haley's chest tightened. What bad men, sweetheart? The ones Daddy talks about on the phone. He uses his scary voice when he talks about them. Children noticed everything, absorbed details that adults thought they were hiding. Lily had been living in the shadow of this threat without understanding what it meant, picking up on the tension and fear that had begun creeping back into their lives. Yes, Haley said finally. There are some bad men who want to hurt people, and Daddy has to stop them. Will you help him? The simple question carried a weight that nearly broke her. Would she help him? Could she stand by and watch the man she loved transform back into someone she might not recognize? Could she be part of the violence and darkness that was about to engulf them all? I don't know how, she whispered. Lily looked up at her with those impossibly wise eyes. You love him. That's how you help. From the mouth of a child came the truth that all of Haley's adult reasoning had failed to grasp. Love wasn't just about the peaceful moments, the quiet domesticity they'd built together. Love was about standing beside someone when the world tried to tear them apart, about fighting for the person they could be, even when circumstances demanded they become someone else. She thought about Ethan in the dining room, surrounded by maps and intelligence reports, planning operations that could cost him his soul. He was preparing to sacrifice everything he'd become to protect the family he'd found. The least she could do was refuse to let him do it alone. When she and Lily returned to the house, Ethan was alone at the dining room table, staring at a photograph that Marcus had provided. It showed Vincent Romano leaving what appeared to be an expensive restaurant, flanked by bodyguards and looking every inch the successful criminal executive he was becoming. He's younger than I expected, Haley said, settling into the chair beside him. 35, smart, educated, patient. Everything his uncle wasn't. Ethan's finger traced the edge of the photograph. He spent 5 years in prison learning from everyone's mistakes. Now he's applying those lessons. What's the timeline? Ethan looked at her sharply, surprised by the question. 24 hours, maybe less. Vincent expects an answer to his offer, and when I don't give him one, he'll escalate. Then we better make sure we're ready. We? Haley met his eyes steadily. I'm not sitting in a safe house while you fight for our future. If this is happening, we face it together. Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but something in her expression stopped him. She could see him recognizing the woman who had stood beside him in that cabin when Romano's men attacked, the woman who had swung an iron pan to protect his daughter. She wasn't just the nurse he'd fallen in love with. She was a fighter, too, when the stakes were high enough. It's dangerous, he said finally. Everything worthwhile is dangerous. Our first meeting was dangerous. Falling in love with you was dangerous. Building a family was dangerous. I'm tired of being careful, Ethan. I'd rather be brave. For the first time in days, she saw a flicker of the man she'd fallen in love with behind the strategic mask he'd been wearing. The man who had seen something special in a woman crying alone in a restaurant, who had believed she deserved better than the world was offering her. All right, he said quietly. But we do this my way, and if I tell you to run, you run. No arguments, no looking back. Deal. Outside, the suburban evening continued its peaceful rhythm. Children called in for dinner, porch lights flickered on, and families settled into the comfortable routines of normal life. But inside the safe house, 3 people prepared for a war that would determine whether they would ever have the chance to be normal again. The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward midnight. counting down the hours until Vincent Romano would learn that Ethan Moretti had chosen his answer, and in choosing it, had chosen who he would be for the rest of his life. Dawn came gray and cold, with the kind of autumn chill that promised winter wasn't far behind. Haley woke to find Ethan's side of the bed empty, though the sheets still held the warmth of his presence. Through the window, she could see him in the backyard, moving through what looked like a combat routine, his body flowing through precise movements that spoke of years of training and preparation. She watched him for several minutes, noting the way he seemed to inhabit his physical form differently than he had during their peaceful months at the cabin. There was a coiled tension in his shoulders, a predatory awareness in the way he scanned his surroundings even during what should have been a private moment. The transformation was both impressive and terrifying. "Daddy's doing his morning exercises," Lily observed from beside her, having climbed into the bed sometime during the night. "He looks angry." "Not angry," Haley corrected gently. "Focused. He's getting ready to protect us." But as she watched Ethan's routine continue, she wondered if there was really a difference anymore. Marcus arrived before 8, his face carrying the kind of grim satisfaction that suggested developments in their favor. He found Ethan in the kitchen, already dressed in dark clothing that managed to look both professional and tactical. "Vincent took the bait," Marcus reported, accepting a cup of coffee from Haley. "He's planning something public this afternoon, a show of force designed to demonstrate that he's the new power structure in the city." "Where?" Ethan's voice was clipped, efficient. "The old Romano restaurant on 5th Street. He's holding a meeting with representatives from his backing families, plus local business owners who he wants to partner with. Our source inside says it's scheduled for 2 o'clock. Haley felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The restaurant where it had all begun, where Vincent's uncle had once held court, seemed like a deliberately chosen venue. Vincent wasn't just rebuilding his family's empire. He was making a statement about reclaiming their legacy. "Security?" Ethan asked. "Tight, but not impenetrable. He's got maybe a dozen men inside, another half-dozen on the street. The problem is the civilians. The meeting is happening during lunch service, so there will be innocent people in the building." This was the kind of moral complexity that had driven Ethan from his old life in the first place. The necessity of violence balanced against the imperative to protect the innocent. It was an impossible equation, one that required the kind of calculations that kept good men awake at night. What about law enforcement response? Marcus's expression grew darker. That's the interesting part. Vincent's federal protection seems to extend to local coordination. Response times have been adjusted for that area today. We'll have maybe 15 minutes before anyone official shows up. 15 minutes to confront Vincent Romano and his assembled forces, neutralize the threat they represented, and escape before the authorities arrived to clean up the mess. It sounded like the kind of operation that looked simple on paper and became a nightmare in execution. "What's the play?" Marcus asked. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant as he ran through scenarios and contingencies. When he spoke, his voice carried the cold authority that had once made him one of the most feared men in the city. "We don't go in shooting. Too many civilians, too much risk of collateral damage. Instead, we make Vincent come to us." "How?" A smile crossed Ethan's face that was entirely without warmth. "By giving him something he wants more than a public display of power. By giving him the chance to humiliate me personally." The plan, as Ethan outlined it, was both elegant and terrifying in its simplicity. He would walk into the restaurant alone, presenting himself as someone ready to negotiate surrender. Vincent's ego and need for public vindication would compel him to turn the meeting into a spectacle, a moment of theater designed to cement his position as the new king of the criminal underworld. But while Vincent was focused on his moment of triumph, Marcus would be positioning their people around the building's exits, ready to contain the situation when it inevitably went wrong. And Haley? "No," she said flatly when Ethan explained her role. "Absolutely not. It's the only way to ensure Lily's safety," he insisted. "Vincent needs to see that he's got leverage over me, something that makes surrender preferable to resistance. If he thinks you're vulnerable, he'll focus on you instead of looking for the trap we're setting." The logic was sound, but it required Haley to walk into the restaurant with him, to put herself within reach of Vincent Romano and his men, to become bait in a plan that could go catastrophically wrong in dozens of different ways. "What if he doesn't buy it?" she asked. "What if he sees through the deception?" "Then we improvise," Ethan said grimly. "But Vincent's weakness is his need to be seen as legitimate, as the rightful heir to power. He'll want witnesses to my surrender, proof that he succeeded where his uncle failed." Marcus was studying the building schematics on his tablet, marking exits and sight lines with the methodical precision of someone who'd planned dozens of similar operations. "The kitchen has a service entrance that connects to the alley. If things go sideways, that's your extraction route." "What about the civilians?" Haley pressed. "The people having lunch who have no idea they're walking into a war zone?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "We try to minimize exposure. Vincent's smart enough not to start shooting in a room full of witnesses unless he has no choice. The key is making sure he doesn't reach that point." The plan continued to evolve throughout the morning, each detail refined and contingencies mapped out. Phone calls were made to allies who owed Ethan favors, resources were positioned, and weapons were checked and rechecked. It felt like watching a machine being assembled, each piece fitted precisely into place for maximum efficiency. But as the clock moved steadily toward noon, Haley found herself thinking about the randomness of it all. 6 months ago, she had been a nursing student whose biggest worry was paying rent. Now she was planning to walk into what was essentially a military operation disguised as a business meeting. The surreal nature of her transformation wasn't lost on her. "Second thoughts?" Ethan asked, finding her in the living room where she was braiding Lily's hair with perhaps more attention than the task required. "Third and fourth thoughts," she admitted, "but not about doing it. About all the things that had to happen to bring us to this point. If I hadn't been stood up that night, if you hadn't been at that restaurant, if Vincent had stayed in prison where he belonged. If, Ethan said gently. "We could trace it back to the moment I was born, or the moment Vincent's uncle decided to build an empire. But we're here now, and the only thing that matters is what we do next." Lily looked up from her coloring book, her small face serious. "Daddy, are you going to hurt the bad men?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Ethan knelt beside his daughter's chair, his expression careful and honest in the way he'd learned to be with her. "I'm going to try very hard not to hurt anyone," he said. "But sometimes, when people threaten the people we love, we have to be strong to protect them. Will you come back?" "I will always come back to you, sweetheart. That's a promise." Haley watched the exchange with a tightness in her chest. Ethan was making promises he might not be able to keep, offering reassurances that circumstances might make meaningless. But she also understood that some promises had to be made regardless of their probability, because they represented hope in the face of impossibility. At 12:30, they began final preparations. Ethan changed into an expensive suit that had been tailored to conceal the weapons he carried, while Haley selected clothing that would allow her to blend into the restaurant's lunch crowd while remaining practical for rapid movement if necessary. Marcus performed final equipment checks, ensuring that everyone was connected via encrypted communications and that backup plans were in place for every conceivable scenario. The professional thoroughness was both reassuring and terrifying. "Remember," Ethan said as they prepared to leave the safe house, "Vincent's going to try to provoke me. He'll want me angry, off balance, making mistakes. Whatever he says about you, about us, about the life we've built, don't let it get under your skin." "What if he threatens Lily?" Ethan's eyes went flat and cold. "Then the plan changes, and Vincent Romano learns why his uncle spent 5 years trying to kill me and failed." The drive to the restaurant passed in tense silence. Haley found herself memorizing details of the neighborhood, the positioning of Marcus's people, the location of their escape route. Her nursing training had taught her to prepare for emergencies, but nothing had prepared her for this kind of methodical approach to potential violence. The Romano restaurant was exactly as she remembered from Ethan's descriptions during their quiet months at the cabin. Red brick facade, small windows, the kind of old-fashioned Italian establishment that spoke of family traditions and generational recipes. It looked utterly innocent, the sort of place where families might celebrate anniversaries or business deals might be concluded over excellent wine. But as they approached the entrance, Haley could see the subtle signs of its current purpose. Men in expensive suits who paid too much attention to their surroundings. Cars parked with deliberate positioning rather than convenience. The weight of concealed weapons altering the way people moved and stood. "Last chance," Ethan murmured as they reached the door. "You can still walk away from this." Haley squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his fingers, the slight tremor that betrayed his own nervousness. "We finish this together." The restaurant's interior was dimly lit and filled with the rich aromas of garlic, tomatoes, and fresh bread. Under different circumstances, it would have been inviting, romantic even, but today it felt like a stage set for a drama that could end in tragedy. Vincent Romano was holding court at a large table in the center of the dining room, surrounded by men in expensive suits who radiated the kind of casual menace that came with power and violence. He looked up as Ethan and Haley entered, his smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Ethan Moretti," he said loudly enough for the entire restaurant to hear. "And the lovely Haley, how good of you to join us." The restaurant fell into the kind of silence that preceded either celebration or catastrophe. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, forks paused halfway to mouths, and the very air seemed to thicken with anticipation. Vincent Romano rose from his chair with theatrical deliberation, his movements calculated to draw every eye in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. "You are witnessing history today. The former king of this city has come to pay his respects to the new order." Haley felt the weight of dozens of stares, some curious, some fearful, some predatory. The civilian diners looked confused and increasingly uncomfortable, sensing that their quiet lunch had become something else entirely. The men in expensive suits watched with the focused attention of professionals evaluating a potential threat. Ethan moved forward with the careful poise of a man walking into a trap he'd helped design. His hand remained steady at Haley's back, a constant point of contact that conveyed both protection and connection. "Vincent," he said, his voice carrying across the restaurant with quiet authority. "You wanted to talk. Here I am." Vincent's smile widened. "Oh, we're well past talking, my friend. Today is about understanding, about accepting new realities." He gestured broadly at the assembled crowd. "These people represent the future of business in this city. Legitimate enterprises that need protection, guidance, partnership. The kind of empire my uncle never understood how to build." It was a performance, Haley realized. Vincent wasn't just trying to humiliate Ethan. He was establishing his credentials with an audience that included potential allies, rivals, and witnesses. He was making himself into a story that would be told and retold until it became legend. "And what role do you see me playing in this new empire?" Ethan asked. "The role you were born for," Vincent replied. "Advisor, enforcer, the man who keeps the peace through the judicious application of fear. Your reputation precedes you, after all." A waiter appeared at Haley's elbow, apparently oblivious to the tension crackling through the air. "Would you care for a table, ma'am?" The surreal normalcy of the moment nearly broke her composure. Here they were, negotiating the terms of what amounted to a criminal enterprise, while servers continued to take orders and deliver pasta to tables full of civilians who just wanted a nice lunch. "We'll stand," Ethan said curtly. Vincent tisked disapprovingly. "Nonsense. This is a civilized establishment. We can discuss business like gentlemen." He snapped his fingers, and two of his men immediately vacated chairs at the main table. "Please join us." It wasn't really a request. The positioning put Ethan and Haley in the center of the room, surrounded by Vincent's people, with limited options for rapid exit, but it also put them where they needed to be for the plan to work. As they settled into the offered seats, Haley caught a glimpse of Marcus through the front window, positioned across the street with the casual anonymity of someone waiting for a bus. Other faces moved in her peripheral vision, Ethan's people taking their assigned positions. "Now then," Vincent said, settling back into his chair with obvious satisfaction. "Let's discuss terms. My sources tell me you've been living quietly, playing house with your little family. Very touching, very domestic. But we both know that's not who you really are." Ethan's expression remained carefully neutral. "People change, Vincent. Your uncle never understood that." "Do they? Or do they just pretend to change until circumstances force them to reveal their true nature? Vincent's gaze shifted to Haley, and she felt something cold crawl up her spine. Take your lovely fiancé here. A nurse, I'm told. Someone who saves lives rather than taking them. How does it feel, my dear, knowing that the man you plan to marry has killed more people than some diseases? The attack was personal, designed to drive a wedge between them, to make Haley question everything she thought she knew about Ethan. But she'd already wrestled with those demons during the long months of falling in love with a man whose past was written in blood. I know exactly who he is, she said quietly, both who he was and who he's chosen to become. The question is whether you're smart enough to understand the difference. Vincent laughed, the sound rich with genuine amusement. Oh, she has fire. I can see the attraction, Ethan. But fire burns, doesn't it? And when the flames get too hot, even the strongest men get burned. Around the table, Vincent's associates watched the exchange with the fascination of people watching a chess match played with human pieces. They were evaluating, calculating, trying to determine whether Ethan Moretti was truly the broken man Vincent claimed, or if this was an elaborate performance. Here's what I'm offering, Vincent continued, his tone shifting to something more businesslike. You work for me. Your skills, your connections, your reputation all serve my organization. In return, I ensure that your retirement remains undisturbed. No more late-night visits, no more threats against your family. You help me build something that lasts, and I let you keep your little slice of domestic bliss. And if I refuse? Vincent's smile turned predatory. Then I demonstrate to everyone in this room why refusing me is a mistake that people don't get to make twice. The threat was clear, but something in Vincent's posture suggested he was enjoying the moment too much to bring it to a rapid conclusion. He wanted to savor Ethan's surrender, to milk every drop of humiliation from the encounter. That psychological need might be the opening they were looking for. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming thoughtfully on the white tablecloth. You know, Vincent, your uncle made me a similar offer once, back when he thought he had me cornered. And look how that turned out for him. Yes, look how it turned out. Ethan's voice carried a note of something that might have been amusement. He underestimated the most important thing about negotiating from a position of strength. Vincent's eyes narrowed slightly. Which is, you have to actually be in a position of strength. The words hung in the air for a heartbeat before Vincent's expression began to change. Confusion flickered across his features, followed rapidly by suspicion, and then something that might have been the first stirring of fear. What? He began, but Ethan was already moving. The signal was subtle, just a hand placed flat on the table, but it was enough. Through the restaurant's windows, Haley saw Marcus and his team beginning to close in on the building. Other diners, suddenly alert to the shift in atmosphere, began to look around with growing alarm. The problem with public displays of power, Ethan said conversationally, is that they require an audience that can't leave. You chose the wrong venue, Vincent. Vincent's hand moved toward his jacket, but froze as he realized that several of his own men were no longer looking at Ethan. They were looking at the exits, where unfamiliar faces had appeared with the casual positioning of people who knew how to control a room. You son of a... Language, Vincent. There are families present. The restaurant erupted into chaos as civilians suddenly realized they were in the middle of something far more dangerous than a business lunch. Chairs scraped against floors. Voices rose in alarm, and people began moving toward exits with the urgent purpose of those who recognized imminent danger. But as the crowd surged toward the doors, they found their way blocked by men who appeared from nowhere, politely but firmly encouraging them to remain seated until the current discussion was resolved. Vincent's face flushed red with rage and what was clearly the beginning of panic. You think you can walk in here and dictate terms to me? This is my territory now. Your territory? Ethan's voice remained calm, almost conversational. Vincent, the first rule of claiming territory is making sure you can hold it. And right now, you're surrounded by people who answer to me. The revelation hit Vincent like a physical blow. He looked around the room with growing desperation, trying to count allies and enemies, trying to figure out how badly he'd miscalculated. You're bluffing, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Ethan pulled out his phone and placed it on the table. With deliberate precision, he dialed a number and put the call on speaker. "Marcus," he said when the call connected. "In position, boss. We've got the building secured and law enforcement is being delayed, as discussed." Vincent's face went white. The federal protection he'd been counting on had evaporated, leaving him isolated and vulnerable in exactly the kind of public confrontation he'd thought he was orchestrating. "Now then," Ethan said, settling back in his chair with the relaxed posture of a man who had just revealed a winning hand. "Let's discuss terms. My terms." The shift in power dynamics was palpable. Where moments before Vincent Romano had been holding court like a conquering emperor, he now sat rigid with the dawning realization that he had walked into a trap that had been months in the making. Around the restaurant, his men were beginning to understand that they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The civilians they'd planned to use as witnesses were now potential hostages, and the public venue that was supposed to legitimize Vincent's ascension had become a cage. "Impossible," Vincent breathed, his eyes darting between Ethan and the exits that were no longer available to him. "My contacts assured me." "Your contacts lied to you," Ethan interrupted. "Or more accurately, they told you what they needed you to believe. Did you really think federal law enforcement was going to back a Romano resurgence? Your uncle burned too many bridges, made too many enemies. They were using you, Vincent, letting you gather all the scattered pieces of your uncle's organization in one place so they could sweep up the mess with a single operation." The color drained from Vincent's face as the implications sank in. He hadn't been building an empire. He'd been collecting targets for someone else's operation. His federal protection hadn't been protection at all, but a leash that allowed his handlers to control his movements. "You're working with them," he accused. "You made a deal." Ethan's smile was cold and entirely without humor. "I made several deals, some with people you'd recognize, some with people you never knew existed. The beauty of legitimacy, Vincent, is that it opens doors you never even knew were there." Haley watched the exchange with a mixture of admiration and unease. This was the Ethan Moretti that others had feared and respected, the man who could manipulate complex situations with the precision of a master chess player. But it was also a reminder of how completely he could compartmentalize his life, hiding strategies and alliances even from the people closest to him. Vincent's composure was beginning to crack. The confident criminal executive who had walked into the restaurant was giving way to a desperate man who could see his carefully constructed plans collapsing around him. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Simple," Ethan replied. "You disappear. Tonight. You take whatever legitimate resources you've managed to accumulate and you find somewhere else to be. Permanently. And if I refuse? Then the federal agents waiting outside come in and arrest you for conspiracy, racketeering, and about 15 other charges that will put you away for the rest of your natural life. Your choice." Vincent looked around the room desperately, seeking some avenue of escape or negotiation. But his men were now focused entirely on survival, and the civilians were too frightened to serve as useful shields or witnesses. "My backers won't let this stand," he said, grasping for some remaining leverage. "The Torinos, the Castellanos, are already cutting their losses." Marcus's voice came through the phone speaker. "Turns out nobody wants to be associated with a sinking ship. Amazing how quickly loyalty evaporates when the FBI starts asking questions." The final piece of Vincent's support structure crumbled with those words. Criminal organizations were businesses, and businesses didn't make emotional decisions about failed investments. If Vincent couldn't deliver on his promises, he became a liability rather than an asset. "You've got 10 minutes to walk out of here," Ethan continued. "After that, you become someone else's problem." But Vincent Romano hadn't survived 5 years in federal prison by accepting defeat gracefully. His hand moved with desperate speed toward the weapon concealed beneath his jacket, gambling everything on one final play for survival. The restaurant exploded into motion. Vincent's gun cleared leather just as Haley threw herself sideways, knocking over her chair as she sought cover behind the heavy wooden table. Ethan moved with fluid precision, his own weapon appearing in his hand as if conjured from thin air. The first shot shattered a wine glass 6 inches from Haley's head. The second splintered the wooden chair where she'd been sitting moments before. Around the room, Vincent's remaining men reached for their weapons, while Marcus's people moved to contain the situation before it could spiral into a massacre. But Vincent wasn't aiming at Ethan. He was aiming at Haley, gambling that her death would break the man who had destroyed his plans. It was a calculation born of desperation and rage, the last throw of dice by someone who had nothing left to lose. Ethan's return shot took Vincent in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon flying across the restaurant floor. The younger Romano stumbled but didn't fall, his face twisted with pain and fury. "You want to protect her?" Vincent snarled, clutching his wounded shoulder. "Let's see how well you do that when she's dead." He lunged toward where Haley crouched behind the overturned table, a knife appearing in his good hand. But his path was blocked by a figure that seemed to materialize from thin air. Marcus caught Vincent's wrist in mid-strike, the knife inches from Haley's throat. With brutal efficiency, he twisted the arm until bones snapped and Vincent screamed, the weapon clattering to the floor. "Nobody threatens the family," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of cold certainty that came from absolute loyalty. Around the restaurant, the brief explosion of violence was contained almost as quickly as it had begun. Vincent's men, seeing their leader wounded and defeated, made the pragmatic choice to surrender rather than fight a battle they couldn't win. Ethan moved to Haley's side, helping her to her feet with gentle hands that belied the violence he'd just committed. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, though she was trembling with adrenaline and shock. "I'm okay." "But Vincent is finished," Ethan said firmly. He looked down at Vincent, who was curled on the floor, cradling his broken arm. "You had your chance to walk away. Now you get to live with the consequences." Outside, sirens were beginning to wail in the distance. The federal agents Marcus had mentioned would be arriving soon, along with local law enforcement who would find a restaurant full of witnesses to what would officially be recorded as an attempted robbery gone wrong. "Time to go," Marcus advised, appearing at Ethan's shoulder. "Cleanup crew will be here in 5 minutes." As they moved toward the kitchen exit, Haley caught a glimpse of Vincent Romano being lifted onto a stretcher by paramedics who had appeared with suspicious speed. He would survive his wounds, but his empire was finished before it had truly begun. The alley behind the restaurant was cool and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos they were leaving behind. Ethan's car waited in the shadows, engine running, ready for their escape. "Is it over?" Haley asked as they drove through the darkening streets. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his hands steady on the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the road ahead with the habitual wariness that might never entirely leave him. "Vincent's finished," he said finally. "His organization is scattered, his backing has evaporated, and he'll be facing federal charges within the hour. But there will always be someone else, Haley. Someone who thinks they can succeed where others failed." It wasn't the answer she'd wanted, but it was honest. In Ethan's world, victory was always temporary, peace was always fragile, and the price of safety was eternal vigilance. "So what do? "We go home," he said simply. "We pick up Lily, we return to our cabin, and we keep building the life we want. And if someone else tries to take it away from us, we'll deal with that too." The lights of the city blurred past the windows as they drove toward the safe house where Lily waited with her coloring books and innocent trust that her father would always come home. Behind them, the Romano restaurant would become a crime scene, a footnote in someone else's investigation. But ahead of them lay the possibility of peace, fragile and hard-won, bought with violence but sustained by love. It wasn't the ending Haley had once imagined for herself, but it was theirs, and that made it precious beyond measure. 3 weeks later, Haley stood in the kitchen of their cabin, watching steam rise from her coffee cup, while morning light painted golden rectangles across the wooden floor. The familiar ritual of breakfast preparation had resumed, but everything felt different now, charged with the knowledge of what they were capable of when pushed to extremes. Lily sat at the table, carefully coloring inside the lines of a picture that showed a house, a tree, and 3 stick figures holding hands. The normalcy of the scene was both comforting and surreal after everything they'd experienced. "The princess lives in the castle with the king and queen," Lily explained seriously, adding purple flowers to the base of the tree. "And they're all safe because the dragon went away." "Did the dragon go away forever?" Haley asked, settling into the chair beside her. Lily considered this with the gravity that 5-year-olds brought to important questions. "I think dragons always come back sometimes. but the king knows how to make them go away. From the mouths of children came wisdom that adults spent years learning. Dragons did always come back in one form or another. The trick was learning to face them without losing yourself in the process. Ethan emerged from his home office, where he'd been handling what he now called transition business. The careful dismantling of old networks, the severing of ties that were no longer necessary or safe. The transformation from criminal kingpin to legitimate businessman was proving to be almost as complex as the reverse had been years earlier. "Marcus called," he said, accepting the coffee Haley offered him. "Vincent pled guilty to federal charges yesterday. 25 years, no parole." It was over then. Really, finally over. Vincent Romano would spend the rest of his productive years in a federal prison, and his scattered organization would never reform under his leadership. The threat that had pulled them back into darkness had been neutralized, but Haley found herself feeling oddly empty rather than relieved. She'd spent months learning to live with fear, and its sudden absence left a void she wasn't sure how to fill. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we figure out what normal looks like," Ethan replied, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely sure what that meant either. The question haunted them both over the following days. What did normal look like for a former Mafia boss, a nursing student who'd learned to plan military operations, and a 5-year-old who drew pictures of dragons? How did you build a peaceful life when you'd proven yourselves capable of orchestrating violence? Haley returned to her studies with renewed focus, as if academic routine could provide the structure that chaos had disrupted. The human anatomy made sense in ways that human nature didn't. Hearts pumped blood, lungs exchanged oxygen, bones mended when broken. There were rules, predictable patterns, outcomes that could be calculated and treated. But even in the sterile environment of the nursing lab, she found herself noticing things differently. The way people positioned themselves in relation to exits, the unconscious signals that suggested nervousness or deception, the subtle indicators of someone carrying concealed weapons. Ethan faced his own adjustment challenges. The legitimate businesses he'd maintained as cover during his criminal years now needed to become genuine enterprises. Restaurants, construction companies, shipping operations, all required attention and oversight that felt strangely mundane after years of life-and-death decision-making. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," he admitted one evening as they sat on the porch, watching Lily chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "For someone to call with a crisis that needs immediate attention. For the next threat to emerge from whatever shadows I haven't accounted for." "Maybe that's what normal is," Haley suggested. "The gradual realization that most days don't actually contain life or death drama. Maybe peace isn't the absence of all threats. Maybe it's just the space between them." It was during one of those peaceful interludes that Detective Sarah Chen appeared at their door on a crisp October morning. Haley recognized her from news reports about the Romano investigation. A sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who had built a reputation for pursuing organized crime with the persistence of water wearing away stone. "Mr. Moretti," she said when Ethan answered the door. "I wonder if we might have a conversation." They sat in the living room, Lily safely at school, while Detective Chen explained the reason for her visit. Vincent Romano's federal conviction had opened doors that had been sealed for years, revealing connections and corruption that stretched far beyond a single criminal organization. "We're building cases against 3 federal agents who provided Romano with protection," she explained, "plus associated corruption in local law enforcement and city government. Your cooperation could be invaluable in ensuring these prosecutions succeed." It was an offer wrapped in the velvet glove of civic duty, but Haley could see the steel beneath. Cooperation wasn't really optional for someone with Ethan's history, not if he wanted to maintain the legitimacy he'd worked so hard to establish. "What kind of cooperation?" Ethan asked. "Testimony about Romano's federal connections, details about how his protection was arranged and maintained, evidence that you might have gathered during your business interactions with corrupt officials." The detective's carefully neutral tone couldn't hide the fact that she was asking Ethan to become a witness against the very system that had once sheltered him. It was dangerous territory, the kind of public exposure that could make him a target for anyone seeking revenge against a perceived informant. "I'll need time to consider it," Ethan said finally. "Of course. But Mr. Moretti, I should mention that several other individuals with knowledge of these matters have already agreed to cooperate. With or without your testimony, these cases are moving forward. The question is whether you want to be part of the solution or continue to be seen as part of the problem. After the detective left, Ethan and Haley sat in silence for a long time. Through the windows, autumn light filtered through trees that were just beginning to show hints of gold and red. The seasons were changing, and with them, their lives continued to evolve in ways they couldn't have predicted. "If you testify," Haley said finally, "there's no going back. You become a public figure in a way that makes real privacy impossible. And if I don't, I remain someone who's always looking over his shoulder, wondering when the next federal investigation will come knocking." It was another impossible choice in a life that had been shaped by them, but this time the decision felt different somehow. Less about survival and more about the kind of future they wanted to build. "What does your gut tell you?" Haley asked. Ethan was quiet for several minutes, staring at the fireplace where no fire burned on this warm afternoon. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the certainty of someone who had made peace with a difficult truth. "My gut tells me that I've been running from my past for long enough. Maybe it's time to face it directly, to own what I was and what I've become. Maybe that's the only way to truly put it behind us." That evening, while Lily worked on her homework at the kitchen table, Ethan called Detective Chen and agreed to provide the testimony she needed. It was a decision that would reshape their lives once again, but this time they were making it together, with full knowledge of the consequences. Outside, the first autumn storm was building on the horizon, dark clouds pregnant with rain and change. But inside the warm circle of their kitchen, three people continued the quiet work of building a family, one difficult decision at a time. The dragons might always come back, but they were learning that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was to stop running and turn to face them head on. The federal courthouse in downtown Philadelphia was a monument to justice conceived in marble and glass, its imposing facade designed to inspire confidence in the rule of law. But as Haley climbed the broad steps beside Ethan on a gray November morning, the building felt more like a coliseum where modern gladiators fought battles that would determine the shape of power for years to come. Media vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward an overcast sky like technological prayer wheels. Reporters clustered around the entrances, cameras ready to capture the moment when Ethan Moretti walked through those doors to testify against the very system that had once protected him. "Second thoughts?" Ethan asked quietly, his hand warm and steady in hers. "About a dozen," Haley admitted, "but not about being here with you." The past month had been a whirlwind of preparation, FBI debriefings, meetings with federal prosecutors, and the careful choreography of turning a former crime boss into a credible witness for the government. Ethan had approached it with the same methodical precision he'd once brought to planning territorial wars, but the stakes felt higher now. This wasn't about power or profit. It was about the possibility of redemption. Marcus appeared at their side, his presence both protective and reassuring. He'd insisted on providing security, arguing that Ethan's decision to cooperate had made him enemies in places they couldn't predict or prepare for. "Perimeter secure," he reported quietly, "but we've identified at least 3 individuals with connections to Romano's old network in the crowd. They're probably just here to observe, but probably isn't good enough anymore," Ethan finished. "I know. Stay close." They passed through security with the efficiency of people who had been expected and prepared for. Federal marshals provided an escort through corridors that echoed with the sound of their footsteps and the weight of history being made. The courtroom was smaller than Haley had expected, filled with lawyers, journalists, and observers whose faces ranged from curious to hostile. At the defendant's table, she could see the backs of 3 federal agents whose careers and freedom hung in the balance of Ethan's testimony. Assistant U.S. Attorney Janet Morrison approached them as they found seats in the witness waiting area. She was younger than Haley had expected, perhaps 35, with the focused intensity of someone who had built her reputation by taking on cases that others considered too dangerous or complex. "Are you ready for this?" she asked Ethan. "As ready as I can be," he replied. "But let me be clear about something. I'm testifying because corruption needs to be exposed and punished. I'm not doing this to absolve myself of my past choices or to claim some moral high ground I've never occupied. Morrison nodded approvingly. That honesty is exactly why your testimony will be credible. Juries can smell self-serving lies from across the room, but they trust witnesses who acknowledge their own flaws. Over the next hour, Haley watched Ethan prepare for what might be the most important performance of his life. Not a performance in the sense of deception, but in the presentation of truth in a way that would be compelling and believable to 12 strangers who would decide the fates of the men he was testifying against. When his name was called, Ethan rose with the calm dignity of someone who had made peace with his choices. He squeezed Haley's hand once, briefly, then walked toward the witness stand with steady steps that echoed in the suddenly quiet courtroom. The swearing-in ceremony was brief but powerful. Haley found herself holding her breath as Ethan placed his hand on the Bible and promised to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. It was a moment that seemed to crystallize their entire journey from the shadows into the light. "Please state your name for the record," Morrison began. "Ethan Moretti." "And what was your profession between the years 2015 and 2024? Ethan looked directly at the jury as he answered. "I was the head of an organized crime syndicate that controlled territory in Philadelphia and surrounding areas. We engaged in illegal activities including loan sharking, protection rackets, and narcotics distribution." The courtroom was silent except for the scratch of pens on paper as reporters documented his words. Haley watched the jury's faces, seeing a mixture of fascination and revulsion as they processed the reality of having an actual crime boss testifying before them. "And during this period, did you have contact with federal law enforcement agents?" "Yes. Specifically, I had an arrangement with Agent Robert Fitzgerald, Agent Maria Santos, and Agent David Clark." Ethan's voice remained steady as he named the 3 defendants sitting just 20 feet away. "These agents provided me with advance warning of federal investigations, information about rival organizations, and protection from prosecution in exchange for monetary payments." Morrison walked him through the details methodically. Bank records, recorded phone conversations, documented meetings in hotels and restaurants where briefcases full of cash changed hands. The corruption was systematic, reaching back years, involving not just the 3 agents but a network of officials who had turned federal law enforcement into a protection service for the highest bidder. "Can you describe the nature of your relationship with Agent Fitzgerald?" Morrison asked. Ethan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Fitzgerald was my primary contact. He approached me in 2016, claiming he could provide valuable intelligence about my competitors in exchange for what he called consulting fees. Over time, the relationship evolved into something more comprehensive." "How so?" "Fitzgerald began providing information about pending federal operations, surveillance schedules, planned raids, witness protection details. In exchange, I paid him approximately $50,000 per month, plus bonuses for particularly valuable intelligence." The defense attorney for Agent Fitzgerald, a sharp-faced man named Crawford, leaned forward as if preparing to object, but remained silent. His turn would come during cross-examination. Morrison continued building her case with surgical precision, each question designed to establish not just the facts of the corruption, but its scope and impact. Other witnesses would testify about different aspects of the scheme, but Ethan's testimony was the cornerstone, the first-hand account from someone who had been at the center of the web. "Mr. Moretti, during your association with these agents, did you ever provide information that led to the prosecution of rival criminal organizations?" "Yes, frequently. The agents would ask for intelligence about my competitors, which I provided. This information was then used to build cases against those organizations while leaving my operations untouched." It was a damning admission, one that revealed the extent to which federal law enforcement had been compromised. The agents hadn't just been passive recipients of bribes, they had actively participated in reshaping the criminal landscape to benefit their chosen partners. The testimony continued for nearly 3 hours, with Morrison walking Ethan through specific incidents, documented payments, and recorded conversations. By the time she finished her direct examination, the scope of the corruption was clear to everyone in the courtroom. But Haley knew the real test would come during cross-examination, when the defense attorneys would try to destroy Ethan's credibility by forcing him to confront the full extent of his own criminal history. Crawford stood for his cross-examination with the predatory confidence of a lawyer who believed he could dismantle the prosecution's case by attacking their star witness. His first questions were designed to establish Ethan's history of violence and deception. "Mr. Moretti, isn't it true that you've killed people?" Ethan met his gaze without flinching. "Yes." "How many people?" "I don't keep a count." "More than 5? "Yes." "More than 10? Ethan paused, and Haley could see him weighing his response. "Probably." Crawford smiled, sensing weakness. "Probably? Don't you know how many people you've murdered?" "I know how many people I've killed in self-defense or in defense of others. I know how many deaths I've ordered to protect my organization or eliminate threats. If you want to call all of those murders, that's your choice. But I won't pretend the distinction isn't important to me." It was a masterful response, one that acknowledged the reality of his past without accepting the prosecutor's characterization of his actions. Crawford's smile faded slightly. "Mr. Moretti, you've admitted to running a criminal organization for nearly a decade. You've acknowledged taking bribes, ordering killings, and engaging in numerous illegal activities. Why should this jury believe anything you say?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, and Haley could see him choosing his words carefully. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to fill the courtroom. "Because I have nothing to gain from lying now. I've already lost everything that defined my old life. My organization is disbanded, my assets are seized, my reputation is destroyed. I'm not testifying to get a reduced sentence or favorable treatment. I'm testifying because corruption in law enforcement is a cancer that destroys the possibility of justice for everyone." He paused, looking directly at the jury. "I was a criminal, but I knew I was a criminal. These agents took an oath to uphold the law, then sold their badges to the highest bidder. The difference matters." Crawford continued his assault for another hour, trying to paint Ethan as an unreliable narrator whose testimony was motivated by revenge or self-interest. But each attack seemed to reinforce rather than undermine Ethan's credibility. His willingness to acknowledge his own crimes, his refusal to minimize or excuse his actions, created a portrait of someone who had nothing left to hide. When the cross-examination finally ended, Ethan looked drained but resolute. He had survived the legal equivalent of a public flaying, exposing every dark corner of his past for judgment by strangers. But he had also done something that might have seemed impossible just months before. He had told the truth about power and corruption in a way that could actually change things. As he stepped down from the witness stand, Ethan's eyes found Haley's in the gallery. She saw exhaustion there, but also something that might have been relief. He had faced his past directly, without excuses or justification, and emerged on the other side still standing. The trial would continue for several more days, with other witnesses and evidence that would fill in the details of the corruption scheme. But Ethan's testimony had been the crucial moment, the point at which abstract allegations became personal truth spoken under oath. Outside the courthouse, they faced a gauntlet of reporters and cameras. Questions flew at them like projectiles. "How do you feel about testifying against law enforcement? Do you expect retaliation? What's next for your family?" Ethan stopped on the courthouse steps, Haley beside him, Marcus providing a protective presence as cameras rolled. For a moment, he looked like what he was, a man who had been tested by circumstances beyond most people's imagination and had chosen to do the right thing, even when it cost him everything. "I can't undo the things I've done," he said simply, "but I can try to ensure that the corruption that enabled those things is exposed and punished. That's what I've tried to do today." It wasn't a speech designed to rehabilitate his image or win public sympathy. It was just the truth, spoken by someone who had finally learned the value of telling it. As they walked to their car through the crowd of reporters and onlookers, Haley felt a strange sense of completion. They had traveled so far from that night in the restaurant when Ethan had first seen her sitting alone with her $5 bill and broken dreams. The journey had taken them through violence and fear, love and loss, and finally to this moment of public reckoning. But the story wasn't over. It might never be over, not completely. Because some stories didn't have neat endings. They just had new chapters, new challenges, new opportunities to choose who you wanted to be. And as they drove away from the courthouse toward whatever came next, Haley knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. It was the only promise that really mattered, and the only one she believed would never be broken. The verdict came on a Thursday afternoon in early December, delivered by a jury that had deliberated for less than 6 hours. Guilty on all counts for all 3 agents. The corruption that had protected Vincent Romano and others like him was finally being held accountable, and the sentences would ensure that none of the convicted agents would ever carry a badge again. Haley watched the news coverage from their cabin, Lily coloring quietly at the kitchen table while snow fell steadily outside the windows. Ethan was in his office, fielding calls from prosecutors, reporters, and federal agents who were now working to identify other cases that might have been compromised by the corruption network. "The agents will appeal," Detective Chen said during one of her periodic check-ins. "But the evidence was overwhelming. Your testimony made the difference." It should have felt like victory, but Haley found herself oddly unsettled by the finality of it all. They had spent so many months fighting for their safety, their family, their future. Now that the immediate threats were neutralized, she wasn't sure what they were fighting for anymore. The question became more pressing as the holidays approached. Christmas had always been Lily's favorite time of year, and this year she had specific requests that reflected their new reality. "I want a big tree," she announced one evening as they sat by the fire. "And I want to invite people over, like Marcus and Dr. Martinez, and maybe some kids from school." It was such a normal request from a child who had spent too much of her young life in hiding. But the idea of opening their home to others, of making themselves visible and accessible, still felt dangerous to Haley in ways she couldn't quite articulate. "What do you think?" she asked Ethan later that night. He was reading financial reports from his legitimate businesses, the kind of mundane paperwork that had once seemed beneath his attention, but now represented the foundation of their legal future. "I think Lily deserves a normal Christmas," he said, "and maybe we deserve one too." The preparations began slowly, tentatively, like people learning to walk after years of paralysis. They bought a tree that was probably too large for their living room, strung lights with the focused intensity of people who had forgotten how to celebrate, and filled their small home with the kind of domestic chaos that families took for granted. Marcus arrived on Christmas Eve with presents for Lily and an expression of bewildered affection for the scene he found. "Never thought I'd see the day," he admitted to Haley as they watched Ethan help Lily hang ornaments on branches that swayed under the weight of her enthusiasm. "Which day is that?" The day Ethan Moretti worried about whether a Christmas tree was straight enough. It was a small moment, but it captured something important about the transformation they had all undergone. The man who had once commanded fear from hundreds of subordinates now spent 20 minutes adjusting tree branches to satisfy his 5-year-old daughter's aesthetic sensibilities. Dr. Martinez came for Christmas dinner, bringing stories from the clinic and gentle questions about Haley's plans for finishing her nursing degree. The conversation was easy, comfortable, the kind of social interaction that built connections rather than serving strategic purposes. "You've changed," the doctor observed as they cleaned dishes together while Ethan and Marcus played board games with Lily in the living room. "How so?" "You're more centered, more confident. Whatever you've been through, it's taught you something about who you really are." Haley considered this as she dried a plate that Lily had insisted on painting herself during a craft project weeks earlier. The imperfect flowers and crooked hearts were beautiful in their innocent imperfection, a reminder that not everything valuable had to be flawless. "I learned that love isn't about finding someone who makes your life easier," she said finally. "It's about finding someone worth making a difficult life with." As January brought the return of routine, they began to establish rhythms that felt sustainable rather than temporary. Haley returned to her nursing classes with renewed focus. Ethan expanded his legitimate business operations, and Lily started taking piano lessons from an elderly woman who lived in town and didn't care about her father's past. But the outside world had not forgotten who Ethan was or what he represented. Interview requests arrived regularly, book agents called with offers, and documentary filmmakers expressed interest in telling their story. It was the kind of attention that could be profitable, but also dangerous, transforming their private life into public entertainment. "We could use the money," Ethan pointed out during one of their discussions about whether to engage with the media attention. "College tuition, medical school if Lily's interested, a larger house if we decide to expand our family." The casual mention of expanding their family stopped Haley mid-sentence. They had talked around the idea occasionally, but never directly addressed whether they wanted more children, whether their unconventional beginning could support the kind of normal family growth that other couples took for granted. "Is that something you want?" she asked. Ethan looked up from the interview request he'd been reviewing. "I want whatever makes you happy. But yes, if I'm being honest, I'd like Lily to have a sibling. I'd like to prove to myself that I can be a father from the beginning, not just someone who learns to be one after the fact." It was a conversation that continued over several weeks, woven through daily routines and evening reflections. The practical considerations were complex: their safety, their finances, the wisdom of bringing another child into a life that might always carry some element of danger. But as winter gave way to spring, Haley found herself imagining the sounds of children playing in their yard, the chaos of homework and school events and soccer practices that defined normal family life. It was a vision that seemed both impossible and inevitable. The decision came, like many of their important choices, without fanfare or dramatic revelation. One morning in April, as she watched Lily chase butterflies in their garden while Ethan worked on his laptop at the porch table, Haley realized that their life had become something worth expanding. "Let's do it," she said, interrupting his concentration on quarterly profit reports. "Do what?" "Have another baby. Grow our family. Take the next step." Ethan looked at her for a long moment, then at Lily, who was explaining something very serious to a butterfly that had landed on her hand. When he smiled, it was with the kind of joy that came from recognizing a moment when everything aligned. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure that I love our complicated, imperfect, extraordinary life. And I'm sure that sharing it with one more person would make it even better." That evening, after Lily had gone to bed with stories about butterfly languages and garden magic, Ethan and Haley sat on their porch and made plans for a future that stretched beyond immediate survival toward something that looked suspiciously like happiness. They were different people than they had been when they first met in that restaurant. Harder in some ways, softer in others, shaped by experiences that most couples never faced. But they had learned something valuable about the nature of love and commitment. It wasn't about finding someone who completed you, but about becoming someone worthy of being chosen, again and again, through every challenge life could present. As spring turned toward summer and their plans began to take concrete shape, Haley allowed herself to believe that their story might actually have a happy ending. Not the kind of fairy tale conclusion that erased all difficulties, but the kind of realistic happiness that came from facing problems together and discovering that love could indeed conquer most things, given enough time and determination. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain but no longer frightening, filled with possibilities that seemed suddenly within reach. And if new dragons appeared on the horizon, well, they had learned something about facing dragons too. Together, they were stronger than anything that might try to tear them apart. And that knowledge, hard-won and battle-tested, was the foundation upon which they could build whatever came next. If you enjoy stories like this, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. That's how I'll know you truly liked it. Even if you're watching on your TV, grab a second to join this family of fans who love emotional and heartfelt stories. Your support means everything, and it helps us bring you even more tales like this one.